Hannah Farrell disappeared on a Tuesday in winter, but in Hollow Ridge, the town only felt its true cold the next morning when fear knocked on the door of every one of its 812 inhabitants. The silence began at the Farrell house. The smell of stale coffee cooling in the kitchen mixed with the whistle of the wind coming through the cracks in the windows. It was this sound that guided Eleanor, Hannah's mother, to her daughter's room, where the silence was heavy, almost palpable. The bed was untouched, the window wide open to a milky fog that swallowed the landscape, and a half-full glass of milk rested on the nightstand. For an instant, Eleanor remembered the night before, Hannah laughing as she said her dream of being a teacher was almost as big as her dream of leaving Hollow Ridge. "I'll come back, Mom," she had promised, "right after I see the ocean." Now, that memory was a stab of pain in Eleanor's chest. On the bedroom floor, there was just one object that didn't belong to her, a small origami bird made from the page of a book that didn't exist anywhere in the house. Hannah was not the kind of girl who ran away. She was the soul of Hollow Ridge, the young woman who helped at the parish and had whispered a prayer for a scholarship to get into college. Her relationship with Tyler, the son of the grocery store owner, was the talk of the town. He was a good kid, but everyone knew about his jealousy. The owner of the town diner had commented, in a low voice, that she'd seen the two of them arguing near the bridge on Monday afternoon. Hannah had looked scared. The comment from Eliza, the diner owner, didn't stay quiet for long. The next morning, as she poured coffee, it was the only topic of conversation. "I saw it, Marlene." The girl's eyes were full of tears, she said to the wife of the grocery store owner, who shook her head in disapproval. "That boy, Tyler, always had a short fuse. Jealousy is a curse." Marlene, who had known Tyler since he was a boy, added with the certainty of someone who knows everything. He couldn't accept her dream of leaving for college. He wanted that girl under his thumb right here in Hollow Ridge. "Nothing good was going to come of that, I always said so." The rumor spread faster than the smell of fresh coffee, and before lunch, the entire town had reached an unofficial verdict. Tyler, the grocer's son, was to blame for his own girlfriend's disappearance. To the local sheriff, Sheriff Morales, a practical man, the story wrote itself. A crime of passion. The boyfriend was the culprit. But Hannah wasn't found the next day, nor the day after. And a week after her disappearance, the story that had seemed so simple unraveled in a gruesome way. Tyler, the main suspect, the boy who swore up and down that he knew nothing, disappeared too. Without a trace, without a warning. In his room, the police found only one thing out of place. On his desk, next to a smiling photo of Hannah, was another origami bird, identical to the first one. It was at that moment that fear, a feeling much denser than the fog itself, descended upon Hollow Ridge. It was no longer a crime of passion. It was a pattern. Sheriff Morales, his face now creased with worry, knew he was dealing with something that went beyond his experience. And the fear had a name the old-timers only whispered. The legend of the collector was older than the town itself, dating back to the time of the first prospectors. It was said that the spirit of a lost explorer haunted these mountains, a man obsessed with collecting rare and beautiful things. According to the legend, he didn't take people. He took souls to build his collection, and he always left behind a sign of his passage, an object that did not belong to this world. The fear that descended upon the town had the weight of a physical body. The streets, once filled with the sound of children playing and neighbors chatting over fences, now echoed with a ghostly silence. Shops closed earlier, the lights in houses switched on as soon as the sun hid behind the mountains, and in every window, a pair of eyes seemed to watch the darkness. Sheriff Morales felt this change in his own skin. He, who had always walked through the town with the confidence of a host, now felt like an intruder in his own home. In his small sheriff's office, the two origami birds rested on his desk like grim omens. He began the investigation at the only possible place, the epicenter of the pain, the Farrell house. Eleanor Farrell had aged, as if the last few days had stolen years from her life. Beside her husband, a quiet man who wrung his hands ceaselessly, she answered the sheriff's questions. No, Hannah had no enemies. No, there had been no strange behavior lately. But then, a memory surfaced in Eleanor's teary eyes. "The book," she whispered. She checked out an old book from the church library, a book of town records, leather-bound with no title. Said it was for a school project, about the founding of Hollow Ridge. She spent the night before she vanished, reading that. It was a small, almost insignificant clue, but it was the only one he had. The conversation was interrupted by the phone. It was Eliza from the diner again. Terrified, she swore she had seen a tall shadow in her backyard the previous night, and that this morning she found a dry branch on her doorstep, twisted in a way that wasn't natural. The sheriff thanked her, but he knew that panic was breeding ghosts. He needed facts, not shadows. The parish record book was heavy and smelled of dust and time. Sheriff Morales took it to his office, flipping through the yellowed pages with faded handwriting. It was then that he decided to seek out the only person in town who might know more about these old stories than the books themselves. Reverend Michael. The Reverend was almost as old as the church where he preached. His deep, lucid eyes seemed to hold the memories of generations. Upon seeing the book and hearing the story of the origami birds, the Reverend's face became a mask of sorrow. He led Morales to a small room in the back of the rectory where the smell of old wood and incense was stronger. "The legend is not a story to scare children, Sheriff," the Reverend said in a low voice. "It's a warning." He then told the full story. The legend of the collector was the modern version of a much older tale from the time of the first prospectors. One of them, a man named Silas Thorne, known as the Seeker of Rare Things, was said to have been lost in these very mountains. Obsessed with beauty and uniqueness, he hunted not just for gold, but for orchids that only grew at the top of the tallest trees, birds of unique plumage, stones of a peculiar shape. The legend said his spirit remained tied to these woods, eternally on his hunt. "He is not evil, in the sense we understand," the Reverend continued. "He is an aesthete, a terrible artist. He collects what he deems perfect." In 1952, it was a boy with the most beautiful voice in the church choir. In 1968, a young woman whose hair was the color of the setting sun. The story of the 1968 girl was the most tragic. Her name was Laura, and her long blonde hair truly seemed to have captured the sunlight itself. That summer afternoon, she was washing clothes in the creek that ran through her family's farm, the cool water running over her feet as she hummed a popular song. The sound of her voice mixed with that of the stream and the wind in the pines. For a moment, she felt a chill, the inexplicable feeling of being watched. She looked around, but saw nothing but the trees and the setting sun, painting the sky in orange and purple. She smiled, dismissing the feeling. The next morning, the sun rose, but Laura did not. Her room was empty, the bed untouched, and on her pillow rested a single impossible flower, a velvety black orchid, a species that only existed in the depths of a jungle thousands of miles away. They disappeared without a trace, except for the sign. Back then, it was a wildflower that didn't belong to our region, left on the pillow. The Reverend looked intently at the sheriff. He adapts, he learns. The origami is just his new signature. Sheriff Morales, a man of the law, felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. This was madness, folklore, the hysteria of a frightened town. But upon returning to his station that night, the silence of the place felt different, deeper. He sat in his chair, the weight of the world on his shoulders, and his eyes fell upon the two paper birds on his desk. They no longer looked like evidence of a crime. They looked like a promise. The promise that the collector had not yet finished his work in Hollow Ridge. That night, Morales couldn't stay at the station. At his house, the silence was just as oppressive. He poured himself a shot of whiskey, feeling the alcohol burn his throat but not warm the cold he felt inside. The Reverend's story about the choir boy from 1952 haunted him for one more reason. That had been his father's last case, the original sheriff of Hollow Ridge, a failure the old man carried to his grave. Driven by an impulse, Morales went up to the dusty attic and found an old wooden trunk. Inside, among faded uniforms and yellowed photographs, was a box of files. In it, a single folder with the inscription, Case 1952, Disappearance of Peter Antunes. He opened it. The pages smelled of time and frustration. Among the reports, his father's handwriting became increasingly erratic. And then he saw it. Stapled to the back cover was a small brown paper bag. Inside, a dark, dry wildflower with a small note attached. The clue that leads nowhere. It was the sign from that era. His father had been one step away from the truth but couldn't see the pattern. At that moment, the case of Hannah Farrell stopped being just a job for Sheriff Morales. It became a matter of honor. In the days that followed, the formal investigation dragged on in a swamp of dead ends. Morales and his two deputies re-interviewed everyone remotely connected to Hannah and Tyler. Hannah's best friend Clara revealed through tears that Tyler had become possessive, even following Hannah home from school. She also said that Hannah, despite being sweet, had a fascination with the macabre, a curiosity about the dark stories their grandparents told. It was she who had encouraged Hannah to look for the old record book at the church. It was like she wanted to find the ghost, Clara said, her voice choked with emotion. The suspicion of a crime of passion committed by Tyler, who then fled, was still the official theory, the only one that made sense in the sheriff's logical world. But if that was the case, where was Hannah's body? And why would Tyler disappear in the exact same way? The town, hungry for a culprit, a face for its fear, soon found a target, a man known only as Mr. K, a visual artist who had moved from New York a year ago to an isolated house on the mountainside. He was an outsider, a recluse, and his art, they said, was disturbing. Sculptures made of twisted branches and handmade paper. Paper, the word ran through the town like wildfire. The suspicion gained traction when Deputy Carter, acting on his own, did a patrol near the artist's house and saw him in the woods. Later in his report, he wrote that the outsider seemed strange, too observant. Public pressure became unbearable. With a preliminary warrant, Morales authorized a search of the property. They found nothing conclusive except for a sketchbook. Kay's art diary was a collection of images of the flora and fauna of Hollow Ridge, but the last few pages were dedicated to a single theme: Hannah. There were dozens of drawings of her, done from a distance, with cryptic notes like "the untouched innocence" and "the beauty the town doesn't deserve." To the deputies, it was proof of a morbid obsession. To Morales, it was the justification he needed for a formal visit. Sheriff Morales, pressured and out of leads, was forced to visit the artist. Kay's house was as strange as his reputation. From the outside, it looked abandoned. Inside, it was a chaotic and fascinating studio. The artist, a middle-aged man with intense eyes and ink-stained hands, was not surprised by the visit. He confirmed that he made his own paper. Yes, he knew the legend of the collector. It was one of the reasons he had moved there, drawn by the energy of the local folklore. When Morales asked to see his work, the artist showed him complex sculptures, and among them, dozens of origami birds hanging from the ceiling, spinning slowly in the draft. They were identical to the ones from the crime scene. The sheriff's blood ran cold. He had found his man. The arrest of Mr. K was the most explosive event in the history of Hollow Ridge. The town breathed a sigh of relief. They had their monster, but the tranquility was short-lived. In the interrogation room, the air was heavy. K did not seem intimidated. He faced Morales with an amused intensity, as if the sheriff were part of his performance. "So, am I the monster of the week, Sheriff?" he asked, his voice calm. Morales threw the sketchbook on the table. "This is an obsession, Mr. K, or is it a catalogue?" The artist flipped through his own sketchbook with professional detachment. Obsession, catalogue, number, it's a study. The girl was the personification of this place's soul, beautiful, about to be corrupted by the world. I didn't touch her, I captured her, with my pencil. The ambiguous answer infuriated Morales. "And the origami birds in your studio?" Identical to the ones the killer left. Kay smiled, a thin, irritating smile. "Sheriff, the legend is the oldest piece of art in this town. I merely reinterpret it. The collector leaves one sign. I leave hundreds. Which of us has better taste?" Kay was toying with him, hiding behind metaphors and cheap philosophy. Morales was about to formally charge him with obstruction. And then he presented an irrefutable alibi for the night of Hannah's disappearance. He was in Seattle, at the opening of his own exhibition, with dozens of witnesses and photos published in a major newspaper. He was released in less than 24 hours, but the contemptuous glares of Hollow Ridge's residents would follow him forever. The sheriff was back at square one, humiliated and more lost than ever. The false lead had diverted him, but it had also taught him something. The legend was not just a story. It was an active force, capable of manipulating reality and the perceptions of everyone, including his own. Frustrated, he returned to the only piece of evidence that felt authentic, that existed before the panic began: the parish record book. He took it home, determined to leave no stone unturned. He spent the entire night hunched over the pages, the old handwriting blurring before his tired eyes. He was no longer looking for names, but for anomalies. And that's when he noticed it, next to certain records of death or disappearance over the centuries, including the 1952 and 1968 cases the Reverend had mentioned. There were tiny annotations in the margin, made with a different ink. They were astronomical symbols, a sun for the solstice, a moon for the equinox. The sheriff's heart hammered in his chest. He grabbed an old calendar and began to cross-reference the information. The dates matched. The disappearances were not random. They were ceremonial events, tied to a cosmic cycle. Seized by a feverish urgency, he took a map of Hollow Ridge and marked the location of each event. The house where the choir boy vanished in 1952, the creek where the girl with sun-colored hair was last seen in 1968, the Farrell house, Tyler's house. The points on the map were not random. They formed the vertices of an imperfect star, a macabre constellation drawn over the town's geography. And there was an empty point, a place that would complete the geometric shape. With trembling hands, he identified the location, the old abandoned chapel on top of Eagle's Peak, the highest and most isolated point in Hollow Ridge. He went back to the calendar. The winter solstice had already passed. The next celestial event was the spring equinox, 2 weeks away. But the legend, according to the Reverend, said that the collector sometimes acted ahead of schedule, moved by the beauty of an item he could not wait to have. The pattern was clear. The next location was marked. The collector wasn't finished. He was just taking a pause. The investigation of a past crime had transformed into a terrifying race to prevent a murder in the future. The discovery of the pattern on the map brought Sheriff Morales no relief, only a clearer form of terror. He was no longer hunting a ghost from the past. He was caught in a trap set for the future. The 2 weeks until the equinox felt like a death sentence. Every passing day was a grain of sand falling through the hourglass for another anonymous victim. The paranoia consumed him. He spent his nights wide awake at the station, the map of Hollow Ridge spread across his desk, the macabre constellation staring back at him. His 2 deputies, men accustomed to the quiet routine of the town, looked at him with a mixture of pity and fear, unable to comprehend the obsession that had taken hold of their superior. Morales knew he couldn't wait. The legend said the collector acted according to the stars, but the arrest of Mr. K had taught him that the legend could also be a mask. And behind the mask, there was a human intelligence, unpredictable. He made a decision. He would go to the chapel on Eagle's Peak, not to wait, but to set a trap of his own. On a cold, moonless night, Morales and his 2 deputies, Carter and Evans, climbed Eagle's Peak. The path was a narrow trail, swallowed by vegetation. The silence there was different from the town's. It was an ancient, heavy silence, filled with the noises of the forest. The chapel was a ruin, little more than stone walls and a partially collapsed roof, with the silhouette of a crooked wooden cross against a starless sky. The air was frigid and had a strange, sweet smell, like dead flowers. Inside, the floor was covered with leaves and dust. There was nothing. Deputy Evans let out a sigh of relief. "No one's here, Sheriff. It's just an old church." But Morales felt that something was wrong. His eyes, now accustomed to the darkness, noticed a detail on the stone floor near the ruined altar. One of the flagstones was not covered in dust. It was clean. Together, they lifted it, revealing a stone staircase that descended into absolute darkness. It was a crypt. A frigid air and that same sweet smell rose from the opening like the breath of a tomb. Descending with trembling flashlights, they found the unthinkable. The crypt was not a tomb, it was a museum. In niches carved into the earth and stone, objects were carefully arranged, illuminated by candles. On one side, a lock of blonde hair in a glass box with a label, Sunlight, 1968. On the other, a small hymnal with the label, Angel Voice, 1952. They were the collector's trophies. And then they saw them. In 2 larger niches at the back of the crypt, Hannah and Tyler lay motionless, pale as wax. They seemed to be sleeping, but it was a deep, unnatural sleep. They were alive, their breathing almost imperceptible, and next to them, his back turned, adjusting the position of a small origami bird on Hannah's chest, was a figure in clerical clothing, Reverend Michael. The Reverend turned slowly, without surprise, a serene smile on his face. "Sheriff, I knew your faith in logic would lead you here." His voice was the same calm, wise voice from the rectory, but now it sounded terribly sinister. "Don't worry, they are not dead," he said, gesturing to the youths. "They are merely preserved, saved from decay, from the ugliness of time. Here, they will be perfect forever." Morales, shocked, couldn't process it. "Reverend, why?" The Reverend walked slowly through the crypt. "I am not a monster, Sheriff. I am a curator. The spirit of Thorn lives in these lands. He chose me, many years ago, to continue his collection. He shows me the beauty, the rarity. I merely protect it." He revealed that the record book was, in fact, the diary of the collector himself, passed from curator to curator. Each astronomical annotation was the celebration of a new acquisition. He drugged his victims with a tea made from rare local flowers, which explained the sweet smell, keeping them in a comatose state for weeks before... "Before what, Reverend?" Morales growled. The Reverend smiled. "Before releasing them. When a new piece is chosen, the previous one is returned to nature. The fate of the previous victims, left to their own devices in the depths of the forest, hung heavy in the air. The Reverend was not a direct murderer, but an agent of death, wrapped in his devout madness." In a moment of distraction, as the Reverend admired his collection, Sheriff Morales and his men acted, subduing him. The struggle was brief and pathetic. The old man had no physical strength, only the conviction of his sacred and profane mission. Hannah and Tyler were rescued. They awoke days later with no clear memory of what happened, only the feeling of a long and disturbing nightmare. The arrest of Reverend Michael broke the spine of Hollow Ridge. The town couldn't understand. The man who baptized their children, who comforted their dying, was the monster that haunted their nights. The truth was too much to digest, and so the legend of the collector did not die, it transformed. Many came to believe that the Reverend had, in fact, been possessed by the spirit of the prospector, that he was as much a victim as the others. The supernatural explanation was easier to accept than the idea that pure evil could reside in such a good man. The town was poisoned by doubt. The trust between neighbors dissolved. That silence, once caused by fear of the unknown, was replaced by a silence of shame and disillusionment. Families began to leave, one by one, selling their homes for any price. Hollow Ridge began to die. A year later, Sheriff Morales was in his office, packing his belongings into boxes. He was leaving too. The town was no longer the same, and neither was he. On the desk, the last piece of the puzzle, the Reverend's diary, which he had kept as evidence. On the last page, Michael's handwriting was a trembling scrawl. "He showed me the girl, so full of life, a rare piece. I did not want to, but his will is stronger. The collection must be perfect." Morales closed the book. He had solved the crime, but the question that would haunt him forever remained. Did he arrest a man, or just the body the ghost used? Looking out the window at the increasingly empty streets of Hollow Ridge, he understood. The collector, whether man or spirit, had in the end claimed his rarest piece, the town itself.